At the time of his introduction, Emperor Ganishka was one of, if not the, strongest apostle in the entire series. With his power as essentially a sentient thundercloud, the Dread Emperor was able to blast the Immortal One out of the sky and knock him loopy for a good second, which feels like a short amount of time, but trust us when we say, Ganishka deserves a Lifetime Achievement Award for that one. Even so, his command over his troops, the battlefield, the skies, and the environment itself could never hope to match up to the power of the thing that opposed him. And once Ganishka realized that, he made a decision that changed the entire world. In this video, we'll be talking about how Emperor Ganishka turned into Berserk's version of the Hindu god of destruction, Shiva, and how Shiva's emergence led to the current state of affairs in the manga. So make sure you stick with us until the end to get the full picture. Why did Emperor Ganishka need to increase his power? If you want to know more about the full scope of his abilities, we suggest that you check out our Ganishka anatomy video, because we've gone into a lot more detail on his base form over there. For this segment, we're going to focus on why Ganishka needed to increase his power if he was already so powerful. It is true that Ganishka has one of the strongest, most versatile apostle forms in existence. We called Zod a demonic chimera in his anatomy video. Well, Ganishka is a demonic thundercloud, and trust us, that's as bad as it sounds. The Dread Emperor's release state isn't exactly a transformation of his body per se. He casts his ethereal body into the physical world and draws in water and wind elementals to construct his dense and deadly fog. Ganishka uses this fog for a number of applications, all of which are geared towards ensuring his absolute victory in a war campaign. For starters, he uses this fog to cover the approach of his demonic troops, as well as their retreat. This is to create the element of surprise, yes, but also to cover their true nature from his enemies should they survive. He also puts his fog inside the bodies of the Harashata under his command so he can immediately tell when a sorcerer goes down. This is because replacing sorcerers isn't as easy as dressing up a war slave in Kushan garb. They need to be specially trained and replaced in case of a casualty, hence the precaution. And speaking of precautions, in case of a defeat, Ganishka can use this link to command the Harashata to clean up any leftover Pishacha or Daka so none can figure out their secrets. Also, while his fog is active in any given territory, Ganishka can use it as a GPS tracker and differentiate between human and inhuman presences to adjust his strategy accordingly. And best of all, as long as people think that this is his main body, no one can kill him. Ganishka can switch between flesh and fog at the drop of a hat, and Irvine discovered the difficulty of dealing with such an enemy in chapter 234 when the arrow he loosed in Ganishka's direction went straight through him. The Dread Emperor's offensive powers were just as good, if not better, because one lightning shower from Ganishka was powerful enough to kill several apostles all at once. Only high-level demons like Locus, Zod, and a few others with extremely strong egos were capable of surviving his lightning, if at all. All these factors made Ganishka pretty much untouchable. That is, until his two biggest weaknesses were exposed one after the other. The first came at the hand of Guts. During their showdown, the Black Swordsman unexpectedly collaborated with the Immortal One to bring down the Dread Emperor's assault on Britannis because Guts needed to get out of there and Griffith needed to get in. They put aside their differences and used Shirkei's guidance to detect Ganishka's ethereal body, which should have been active somewhere inside of his gigantic form. Once they found that, the pair risked electrocution and flew right through it. Dragon Slayer first, successfully breaking Ganishka's hold over the city. Zod and Guts didn't come out of this unscathed. Both of them looked like cooked meat after they crashed down, but they showed the world that even a seemingly unbeatable man can be beaten with the right strategy. And they gave Ganishka a disgusting scar across his forehead, which we're sure ticked him off to no end. He would have probably refrained from trying to do something risky to himself had his other weaknesses not been exposed immediately following the first one. When a clandestine nighttime demon assault didn't work, Ganishka decided to besiege Vertanis the conventional way. Yet even there, Griffith had him beat. The reborn Band of the Falcon cut its path through a Kushan war line of 200,000 soldiers and surrounded Ganishka's mobile palace on all sides with their riders and their war demons in the blink of an eye. A messenger tried to get word to him as he sat on his throne, but the poor guy was beheaded by Griffith, who strode into Ganishka's throne room with absolute certainty. The Dread Emperor was seated on a raised platform, and Griffith was beneath him, and yet the roles were reversed in that moment. Ganishka was struggling to keep his composure because his goals clashed with his nature as an apostle, and the latter was bursting forth, trying to take control of him in the presence of its natural master. He was sweating at the fact that Griffith's mere presence was making him tremble, and he nearly had a mental breakdown when the guy spoke. His voice was enough to soothe Ganishka's soul, yet invoke within it a hunger and thirst for more of that satisfaction. It was a maddening sensation, which made the Dread Emperor lose his grip and unleash his released state in self-defense. Griffith simply broke his mobile palace's dome and manipulated the wind itself to blow away all of his fog. That role reversal became literal at this point, because Ganishka fell to his knees after having his fog blown off of him, and he realized he'd been caught lacking. Griffith had exposed his biggest weakness, the fact that a sufficiently strong gust of wind could derail him at any time. By this logic, if Serpico had enough sylphs under his command, he could have handled Ganishka as well, which is insane when you consider his position on the pecking order. The Dread Emperor knew he was done for, which is why what Griffith said next both confused and delighted him. The Falcon had just displayed how easy it was for him to disarm Ganishka. The Kushan army's strength flowed from the top, so if Griffith defeated Ganishka, that meant he effectively defeated the Kushan Empire as well. But despite that, he calls their encounter a stalemate and proposes a final showdown at Wyndham. Of course, we now know that this was because he wanted to bring Geiseric's capital city up out of the abyss, but at the time, it was as confusing to us as it was to Ganishka. Giving up such a clear victory for a spectacle is something only a fool or an aspiring monarch with no experience in actually ruling would do. He accepts Griffith's proposal, signals a rare Kushan retreat, and promises to meet him with the most wicked battle line ever. After that punking, he comes to realize that no matter how many Daka or Pishacha he threw at Griffith, how many times he personally tried to assault the guy, it would always end in failure. That one moment was enough for him to realize the gap between an apostle with godlike powers and an actual god hand. Ganishka understood he'd been playing dress-up all this time, and what he really needed to do now was to find a way to transcend his current limitations. That's why he decided to get an increase in power, because he knew that without it, he might as well kiss his dreams goodbye. Now that we've established the why, let's talk about the how. How did Ganishka turn into Shiva? What made this process so brutal? Those realizations we just mentioned Ganishka having did not surface during some sort of reflective, solitary soliloquy. The Dread Emperor was a man of action who believed in doing things more than just talking about them. As he was addressing those concerns, he was making his way to what he figured was the solution, the man-made Behelit. This demonic apparatus, the magnum opus of Daiba's life, was, in Ganishka's opinion, the only thing that could change the tide of the war. He understood the inner workings of the man-made Behelit and felt that a second reincarnation was necessary for him to even stand a chance. If you want a more detailed breakdown on how this thing works, you should check out our man-made Behelit anatomy video, but only if you want nightmares. For the sake of this one, we'll address its core mechanism. In essence, the man-made Behelit is an artificial Behelit. Its insides are brimming with fluid that's infused with the power of evil. So when pregnant women were lowered within it, their fetuses were mutated into apostle-looking demon spawns. But this apparatus was not created for enhancing the powers of a genuine reincarnation. Even a sorcerer as long-lived and experienced as Daiba had never heard of such a thing, and he was able to deconstruct the inner workings of a Behelit to create his man-made one. By the time he realized what his emperor was planning to do, it was too late to try to change his mind. The genuine article entering an artificial reincarnation vessel, such things didn't happen and shouldn't happen. And that is perhaps why his second transformation was such a brutal affair. Every apostle birth is macabre, because most of them involve sacrifices that the apostles themselves end up partaking in. But Ganishka's second rebirth was haunting, because most of the people he used as sacrifices were not even aware that it was going to happen. To them, it was just a regular night out on patrol. As soon as his body was plunged within the man-made Behelit, the fog that Ganishka had blanketed Wyndham with started gushing towards it. The fog was a part of the Dread Emperor's body, so it trying to rejoin his imperial person wasn't the issue. The issue was the fact that everything that the fog touched was devoured by it. Humans, Daka, Pishacha alike. All living beings that were touching this fog, human or demon, were sucked into the man-made Behelit. Even the dangling apostles that formed its structures were sucked dry by Ganishka's gluttony, and within a matter of minutes, every living thing that roamed the streets of Wyndham had been consumed. It fell deathly silent after that for a long time, and when we say it took a while, we mean it was enough time for General Laban to organize a mass exodus of Wyndham's remaining citizens who had hidden themselves within their homes while all of this was going down. Dawn broke when Ganishka's new form revealed itself in chapter 295, and we can understand why Mura dubbed it Shiva. If you guys don't, you'll learn in just a moment, because the sheer scale of this thing is unfathomable. And yes, we call it a thing because Ganishka is clearly no longer even close to being a human anymore. How tall is Ganishka's Shiva form? How many faces and limbs does it have? Chapter 295 opens with a shot of Daiba fleeing the inner sanctum of the pantheon within which the man-made Behelit was housed. For a guy who was so deeply entrenched in the dark arts, seeing him terrified was quite unnerving, because it could only mean that whatever was on the other side was evil enough to spook even Daiba. He dares to take a look behind him, but like that one saying, perhaps he should have just kept running, because what greets him isn't the face of a human or an apostle, it's the visage of a true demon god. Ganishka's second incarnation had basically turned him into Berserk Cthulhu. He had hundreds of faces now, if not thousands of them, and when he spoke, all of them would emit noises in varying stages of unison. He had more eyes than faces all across the surface of his head, and you didn't hear us wrong here, folks. What Daiba was seeing was just the trapped head of the Demon King. Ganishka tries to communicate with his wizard general to let him know that he had finally obtained the power he desired from the infernal abyss, but the latter was too shocked to even respond to him properly. Daiba couldn't believe the size of his emperor's new form, and he was just looking at its head, though he didn't realize it at the time. The head was big enough to collapse the pantheon from the inside, and while it was humongous, it was nothing compared to the rest of his body. No sooner had Daiba expressed his admiration for Ganishka's new form than he saw a tower collapse in the distance. From beneath the cobbled streets rose a gigantic arm with 9 fingers adorning it, reaching higher than the Tower of Rebirth and the Tower of Conviction combined. The Wizard General wasn't even sure if it was a hand or not, but Ganishka confirmed that it was, and it wasn't a mist either. It was a hand of flesh, and there were several more, nearly 24, in fact, with which he wished to crush his enemies to death. Turns out, Ganishka's entire body was basically stuck underground thanks to his second reincarnation, because he was quite literally rising from the bowels of the astral world. Whenever the astral world overlapped with the physical world, we saw it adapt its energies to those physical surroundings, considering the nature of that region. If its clip-off, forests became more dangerous, and all the wildlife looked like it was created in Sid's bedroom. Elfhelm, on the other hand, looks like a utopian paradise because it's supposed to be a region of happiness and warmth and love and all that good stuff. Ganishka had taken in so much evil power from the astral world that his body now basically extended from the core of the earth to its surface. When it finally materialized as this Lovecraftian monstrosity you see in front of you, he needed space to maneuver, but he was effectively buried under Wyndham City. So he broke Wyndham and climbed up from the abyss in both the physical and metaphorical sense, with a form so massive that it basically touched the Karman line. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically a term used to refer to the edge of space, which begins roughly 55 miles above the surface of the earth. We get a wide shot of Ganishka's entire body at the end of that chapter and the beginning of the next one to truly give us a sense of how big this Shiva form is. You can clearly see mountains in the backdrop of Shiva Ganishka, and the peak of the tallest mountain barely scratches the level of what would have been his calves. He's easily at least 5 times bigger than the tallest peak in his vicinity, if not twice that size, because all of the buildings in Windham come up to basically what his toes would have been. So yeah, his head going beyond the stratosphere isn't all that wacky of a claim when you factor that in. Ganishka's Shiva form looks like a fleshy tree trunk with flower-like palms, branch-like limbs, and 2 massive thick legs with a torso that looks like a log, 9 arms on each side, and hundreds if not thousands of faces adorning his head. It is inspired not only by H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu, but also an ancient Indian myth about Shiva himself. According to this myth, at one point in the distant past, Shiva manifested himself as a fiery linga that spread across the universe. He did so to solve a dispute between his fellow Trimurti members, Brahma and Vishnu, who decided amongst themselves that whoever found the end of this linga first would accept the other's viewpoint. After searching for some time, Vishnu understood that there was no end to this linga, because Shiva was considered to be a manifestation of infinity as well. So he declared that it was infinite and returned to its base. But Brahma lied and said that he had found the top, because a flower fell from the top right into his hands, and he used his divine status to convince it to lie. When the two discussed the outcome of their respective searches, Vishnu was truthful, but Brahma lied. And so Shiva taught him a lesson by banning the use of that flower in his worship and cutting off one of Brahma's original 5 heads, leaving him with only 4. In a way, Ganishka's form is a combination of all these factors with a Lovecraftian design twist. The fleshy trunk-like design of his body is a callback to that eternal linga. His flower-like palms represent that flower forbidden from Shiva's worship, and he has thousands of faces compared to Brahma's 5, but cutting down even one of them would be an immense achievement at this point, considering his head was in the stratosphere. atmosphere. Of course, there is another influence for the same, but we will address that in the next section. When Shiva Ganishka takes a step with his gigantic feet, he crushes a platoon of about 100 soldiers with each of them, and he can be seen moving from hills that are at the border of the Kingdom of Midland. This size alone would be enough to annihilate any sort of human or demon army that tried to attack him, but it wasn't the be-all end-all of his abilities, it was just the beginning. What are Shiva Ganishka's powers? Why is it called an end god? When you grow to the size that Ganishka did when he turned into Shiva, you have little to no time to adjust to the massive change in perspective. As an eldritch monster, Ganishka's eyes were so far up that regular-sized humans looked like tiny insects to him. He crushed them underneath his enormous feet and thought their blood was actually red flowers blooming, so he kept doing it like some sort of child enjoying playtime. Meanwhile, on the ground, his soldiers were fleeing from their emperor because he was trying to trample them to death, and he wasn't even aware of it. Daiba flew up to Shiva Ganishka's head and tried to talk some sense into him. He told the Demon King that he needed to stop walking because he was killing his own forces, but because of Ganishka's new visual perspective, he thought Daiba was a bug and not his wizard general flying on a Garuda. We're not even sure he heard Daiba's pleas, because he needed this gnat away from his ears, so he spits fire at him from 5 different mouths. Daiba ducks that attack and clears out of the scene because he's a genius of the skies, obviously, but Shiva's fire then turns into fireballs, which bombard the earth underneath him, killing even more Kushan soldiers. Daiba realizes that his emperor's ego has completely collapsed, and that he was no longer Ganishka, but more like the destroyer god Shiva himself, the one who uses fire to cleanse the world. In Hindu mythology, it's believed that once Brahma passes, Shiva will set the universe ablaze and kill all mortals and gods with a terrifying form not unlike the one Ganishka takes. It will have thousands of limbs and faces, and will use the cosmic fire of Shiva's being to reduce all to ash, following which Shiva will perform a Tandava upon creation's grave. This is why both he and Ganishka's divine form are also called the End God. Shiva Ganishka's fire-breathing ability is Mura's interpretation of their tale, because it'd be a little silly to have a thing of this size wielding a trident, now wouldn't it? And the storyline reason for this title is because his emergence signaled the end of the world of reason, but we'll address that at the end of this video. Besides spitting fire, Shiva Ganishka had another ability which we're not sure he was aware of, but we'll address anyways. After shooting away Daiba with his fire breath, Shiva Ganishka started wondering what this boundless landscape that he was witnessing was, and why there were only insects in this world. He started wondering where his soldiers and Daiba were, and when his ego collapsed entirely, he started questioning his own identity and purpose in life. But his subconscious remembered, and it went into overdrive when he thought to himself that he needed troops, creating several legions of them for him. Remember how we told you that Shiva Ganishka killed his own troops by the hundreds by simply walking? Well, when he did think of his soldiers, it triggered a change in the red flowers that he had created. The power of the End God channeled itself through the collective blood of those dead soldiers, leading to the creation of countless pseudo-apostles that looked just like him. These pseudo-apostles were large enough to tower over a Zod, and we're talking each of them individually. Also, they were quicker than Shiva Ganishka, so they could make their way to his target before he could, which would have given him a guaranteed victory against any other type of opponent. While we never got to see him put his fire-breathing, or his pseudo-siring, or any of his multiple limbs to any conscious use, if we had, we feel safe saying that that would make Ganishka the strongest apostle in Berserk by far. It might even be stronger than Skull Knight at this point, considering the sheer scope of things it can accomplish with its body. But alas, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And in Shiva Ganishka's case, when he fell, so did the world. How was Shiva Ganishka finally killed? Was there another way to do this? Like we told you guys in the previous section, once Ganishka gained his Shiva form, he quickly started losing his mind. Even when he was talking to Daiba shortly after the rebirth, he was incoherent, and the words were mostly focused on his deep desires and life goals. But as time passed, even that shred of sanity slipped away from him, and his mind gave in to the immense astral pleasure that he had put it through. When Daiba saw the full scope of the Shiva form, he despaired that Ganishka had unleashed hell itself upon Earth, and he wasn't wrong in thinking that way. The Dread Emperor went loony because he couldn't handle the amount of evil energy he absorbed, and shortly after realizing he was making red flowers bloom, he saw the only thing that made sense to chase given his current state of mind: Griffith's light. Ganishka was an apostle at the end of the day, and to them, the God Hand were angels, beacons of warmth and light. The demon god defaulted to his base nature and started chasing after that light in order to ease his own suffering, and to his relief it worked. When Griffith reached the top of Shiva Ganishka's head, the twice reincarnated apostle accepted his fate and gave in to his god's caress. And then, it was split open with Skull Knight's abyss summoning sword of actuation, which brought Ganishka's life to an end. Like Daiba had estimated, Ganishka brought the abyss with him when he became Shiva, because as soon as Femto split his wig, it spilled forth into the world. All of Ganishka's pseudos that were still alive turned into little trees, and Ganishka himself turned into the world's spiral tree, which anchored the spiritual and physical worlds together. According to what Femto says in chapter 304, this was only possible because of Ganishka's reincarnation and Skull Knight's sword of actuation, so it's possible that if either was missing from the equation, the world would have remained the same. But because that isn't the case, and Ganishka didn't really think that he had a choice besides reincarnation, let's take a look at the other half. What if Skull Knight's sword of actuation wasn't at the scene? What if the Wandering Wraith discerned the entire message of causality for once and realized that he should break his own patterns and not show up for once? How would one kill Shiva Ganishka then? Well, if you're Griffith, you can still do it pretty easily considering you're literally Berserk Jesus. But for a regular person, it would be impossible, unless maybe they were gods. Even then, we're not sure how likely it is that even the Black Swordsman could defeat Shiva Ganishka, because his usual fighting style was clearly not going to work here. And most of all, even if he tries to kill it from within, there's no guarantee that its insides would actually be the way we're imagining them. Apostles are connected to the astral world from within, and we've never really seen an apostle's internal organs spilling out like they do from human corpses in Berserk. Most of the time, they just turn back into their human forms, and we see the organs then. It's possible that they don't have an internal body chemistry, because even when we see Zod reattach his arm, we never see his bones, so to speak. But if that isn't the case, then Guts could definitely take down Ganishka, only if he had a lot of help from his companions, especially Shirke. You'll understand why we say that in a video that'll hit our channel soon, so keep your eyes peeled for that one, but we'll just say that someone else was defeated, much like Ganishka, and we think that was intentional on Mura's part. However, at the end of the day, when it comes to people that get involved with demonkind, the will of the God Hand reigns supreme, and in Ganishka's case, he was pretty much destined to die and become the world tree that links the two worlds together. It's crazy how even after his death, Shiva Ganishka is facilitating the destruction of the world, because if you think Griffith has any notion of returning normalcy to the world, you are sorely mistaken, my friends. He will simply continue to cheat and conquer so long as he doesn't have his crown, and once he does, he'll keep doing it till someone makes calling him out for it stick. But that's just not something the people of Falconia will even want to listen to, so this is where we're gonna end our video. Marvelous verdict! His entire life, he thought that he was resisting fate by being the evilest of an evil bunch, but turns out even that part of him had been scouted well by the God Hand. Emperor Ganishka became the End God not because he was going to end the God Hand, but because he was going to help them end the world of reason. The physical and astral worlds had started merging with each other ever since Griffith's incarnation, but Ganishka's transformation was what sealed its fate. Had he not taken that step, perhaps the world would have remained the way it was, and the God Hand wouldn't have as much influence over it as they do now. But hey, what else would you expect from a character inspired by the literal god of destruction? Let us know your thoughts on Ganishka's Shiva form and this video in the comments down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Berserk content, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.